Hi everyone, Dr. Vandenberg here. Today we're going to approach a topic that you might find kind of surprising for this course. It's the question of whether we're living in a simulation. Now, simulation implies that the world doesn't really exist, that it's fake or an illusion or something like that. And you might ask yourself, well, what does that have to do with religion, or the philosophy of religion for that matter? And the angle that I'm going to take on this is to say that if we can't even prove that the world that we're living in is real, then we can't prove that the gods that we imagine are in that universe are real either. In other words, if it's possible or plausible that we're living in a simulation, then everything we think we know about religion has to be false too. In that case, we would have to be very cautious about what we claim to know about the nature of religion. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at with this whole topic here is essentially it's an argument about epistemic humility. Now, episteme, as you might recall, is the Greek word for knowledge. So epistemology is the study of knowledge and how it's possible to know and what exactly we do know. And humility, of course, means being humble about whatever. So in this case, epistemic humility is being humble about what we claim to know, or in other words, not claiming to know more than we really do, or not claiming to know very much at all. You might say that epistemic humility is related to philosophical skepticism. Philosophical skepticism is the view that we don't really know very much, or that it's impossible to know. There's lots of different varieties and flavors of epistemic or philosophical skepticism. And I think, want to draw that connection, although I'm not insisting that we be skeptics. I think that we can know quite a lot of things about the world as it appears. I think that we need to be careful, though, when we make inferences from how the world appears to what causes the world to be the way that it is. And that's the kind of epistemic humility that I'm going to emphasize here. Humility about claims about the causes of the phenomenal or phenomenal world, or the world as it appears to us. Now, there's been a long history in philosophy of attempts to point out that we don't necessarily know that the universe is as it appears to us. And there's some very famous examples. Some of them come from René Descartes in his very famous book called Meditations on First Philosophy. If you take an introduction to philosophy class or an early modern philosophy class, you'll definitely encounter this book or some ideas from it. In that book, Descartes is trying to figure out a solid foundation for epistemology. And he thinks that the way to proceed is to doubt everything that it's possible to doubt until he finds something that's certain. And then he uses that certainty as a kind of a fulcrum, like with a lever, to rebuild a whole epistemology on a foundation of certainty. That's his goal, at least. But in the early part of what he's doing, it's the destructive project of trying to see what can possibly be doubted. And he realizes that there are lots of visual illusions that might make us doubt whether perception is reliable. Our memory is not very good, that sort of thing, so we have to doubt some of our memories. But even more than that, Descartes thinks we can doubt that the world is as it appears to be. So he gives a couple of different arguments along those lines. I'll just mention one of them. They're all effectively the same: the dream argument, the demon deceiver argument, and the divine deceiver argument. In the dream, Descartes says that he imagines that he's sitting by his fireplace, writing and reading, and well, let me start again. So Descartes regularly sat by the fireplace writing and reading. Sometimes he fell asleep while doing so, and had a dream that he was sitting by the fire reading and writing. And during those moments when he was having that dream, he couldn't distinguish whether he was dreaming or awake because the events were exactly the same. Right? So he came to question, well, is it possible to doubt that we're dreaming right now? Could we be asleep and dreaming at this very moment? So if that's true, then we can't tell whether our current perceptions are dream caused or real world caused. And in that case, we can't really claim to know what's happening or what the world is really like. Now, some people, Descartes included, thought that argument was maybe not as strong as it could be. And he said that, well, sometimes we can tell that we're dreaming, Certainly after we wake up, we can recognize that something was a dream. So maybe this dream argument doesn't have the epistemic force that Descartes is looking for. So instead he imagines a different scenario, let's call it the demon deceiver scenario, where there's some very powerful being, doesn't need to be a demon, it can just be something like a very powerful supernatural being who can take complete control of your mind and feed all of your perceptions to you. So all your auditory, visual, tactile sensations, everything else, Descartes imagines could be caused by this very powerful being. And if that's so, then this deceiver could make it so that you think you're experiencing a world when that world doesn't really exist. And Descartes asks, how could we tell? Well, unlike in the dream scenario, we don't wake up, right? We're constantly deceived. And we can't tell from logical consistency or anything like that because we're always in this scenario. So Descartes says that it could be that this demon deceiver is exactly like, is producing a mental world for us, a perceptual world for us that is exactly like what would have been the case if we had been in a real world like that. And since there's no signs that we can use to distinguish whether we're in a real world or in a deceptive illusion, then Descartes says we can't know anything, right? So what's possible to doubt? All of our perceptions. So this is very similar to an idea that we find in George Berkeley, although Berkeley is not trying to show us that the world doesn't exist or that we should doubt it. He's got a different goal. Berkeley's view is called idealism because he thinks that everything is an idea. He has a definition. He says that to be, or in other words, to exist, is to be perceived or to be a perceiver. In other words, the only things that exist, according to Berkeley, are things that are objects of perception or the thing that's doing the perceiving. Okay, so a mind that's doing the perceiving is what he means by a perceiver here. So when he's talking about the things that exist, the outside of minds, or that aren't minds, what he's talking about are ideas, and he's using this word kind of broadly to mean anything that you can have an impression or a perception about. He says if you can't perceive it, then you have no reason to think that it exists. In fact, he's going to say, because he's a strict empiricist, that it doesn't exist unless it can be perceived. Now, the way that Berkeley ends up constructing this account is to say that ultimately our ideas are purely mental. We can't be sure that there's an object behind them that causes them to be that way. In fact, he argues that everything that we know about an object is that it's a collection of perceptual qualities. Think about an apple, right? You can see the color, you can feel the weight, you can taste the sweetness, you can smell the apple smell. All of those things are perceptions which exist in minds. And then we sort of make an inference that there's a thing out there in the world outside of our minds that causes each of those perceptions. Berkeley says that that inference to an external world outside of perception is always a mistake. In fact, he argues that there's a conceptual incompatibility between something being a collection of perceptual qualities and there being and it existing outside of a mind. It's way more than we can get into for today, but the ultimate conclusion, and I think you can probably tell already, is that the universe is purely mental, and in that case, if there's nothing outside of the mind that our mental world corresponds to, then it seems pretty likely that we can't say that our perceptions are true, right? If we think we're seeing an apple that exists in the world, well, we're not actually, right? So then, in that case, all of our perceptions are mistaken in that way. We make a mistaken attribution of external existence when that's not even possible. So in that case, everything we know, again, is going to be subject to some doubt. Now, Berkeley gets out of this by saying that God guarantees all of our perceptions remain systematically correlated and so on, but we don't need to get into those details. Ultimately, Berkeley's idealism is essentially exactly the same as Descartes' demon deceiver, just with a couple of other ideas added. Now, we encounter these kinds of skepticism about the external world in other traditions as well, including in Buddhism, where there's a hypothesis or a claim that the world itself is an illusion and that everything that we perceive is in some sense inherently false. That applies not just to the world in Buddhism, it applies also to our conception of ourself. There's a doctrine in Buddhism that's sometimes called the no self, and the idea there is that there is no you that persists from moment to moment because you're always changing, your mind is always different, your memories are always different, your attitudes are always different, and so there's no you there. There's nothing that we can point at or look at or identify in any way that we can say, oh, that's the thing that is yourself. So this, even our concept of ourself, according to Buddhism, is an illusion. And in that case, of course, there's nothing that we can know, right? Everything that we think we know, everything that we experience ends up being an illusion or false. And so we can't make any conclusions about anything from what we observe, partly because there's no we, there's no I there to do it. Well, again, we don't have time to go into all of that, so that's just an example of a way that people have thought of whether or not our perceptions can tell us that there is an external world. And you can see that the standard view that the external world corresponds to and resembles our perceptions, that standard view, sometimes called realism or naive realism, has had lots of critiques and has had people who've held the opposite position in many cases. So that's just to show you that this is not a new idea. Now, in the 20th century, I think he is a Swedish philosopher named Nick Bostrom, postulated something that is now known as the simulation argument. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. But Bostrom essentially is taking a modern computer science perspective and talking about computer simulation. But ultimately, the situation that he's thinking is possible, or real even, is very similar to Berkeley's idealism or the demon deceiver. Right? It's a false world that we perceive that turns out not to correspond to what's really real. In other words, we are perhaps just a computer simulation, like we're in the Matrix or something like that, and then the external world is going to be something entirely different that we have no idea about. All right, now, why are we talking about that? Well, because if that's true, if we're in something like the Matrix, right, then everything we think about the divine or the supernatural or about God is all going to be false. Because what's really true is whatever's true about the layer above us, right, where they're conducting the simulation. And we have no information about that. And they might be making the simulation quite unlike what the real world is. So then we'd have to be very skeptical that anything we think we know about the divine is actually true. Now that's just one possibility, right, for the way that the world is, but Bostrom thinks that it's likely. This argument, the simulation argument, has a lot of advocates at the moment, including Elon Musk. Elon Musk's credibility has gone down in the last few years, so maybe that's not telling us very much, but some people are still fairly convinced that we're living in a simulation. I happen to think that that's a crazy view and not one that we should take too seriously, but it's at least stimulating to think about. And so I'll give you some more details as we go along here. Just as a sort of a side note, I want to mention that David Hume, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, pointed out that there are many different possible causes of the universe that are compatible with the way the universe appears to be now. The standard inference from the way the world appears to a cause is called the design argument. And in natural apologetics, the design argument says that, well, the world is well designed, that their parts all fit together, and everything seems to work according to a plan of some kind, and therefore there must be a supernatural designer, normally thought of as the omni-god. But Hume points out that that's just one of many possibilities for the way that the universe could be. It could have been created by a committee of gods, there might have been no designer, it might have been self-caused, all of those things, as you'll recall from that lecture on Hume on design argument. So this simulation hypothesis is just another one of those possible causes of the way the world appears to be. So the way the world appears to be a certain way, right? That there's a planet Earth with a moon, and there's a sun that we orbit around, and there's galaxies out there in the universe. All of that is what appears, right? And what is could be something different, right? It could be that there's a set of atoms and molecules out there that came to be through a Big Bang and created the universe as we observe it, right? According to our best science, that's what happens. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the universe was created 5 minutes ago, and all of our memories and all of the evidence about the past were just created at the same time as the rest of the universe. Or maybe something entirely different, right? So Hume's point is that it's very difficult to make a reliable inference from what is observed now to what caused whatever it is that we're observing. And that's very much in line with the thrust of these other ideas that I've just talked about, the dream argument, the deceiver, Berkeley's idealism, Buddhism's illusory world, and so on. Okay, so this is not an unheard of sort of concept, and in fact, it might be fairly respectable. So what does all this show for us? Well, what this shows is that there are possible ways that the divine could be related to our existence that are different than we would have thought. So the standard way to think about the divine is that, well, some divine being caused this universe or affects how this universe runs, or however you want to put it. But these alternative metaphysics, right, like the demon deceiver or the simulation hypothesis, show us that the divine might be just another mistake, right? Our attributions of the action of the divine might be wrong, because what's really going on is that there's a computer creating the perceptions that we have, not a miracle occurring or something like that. Another thing that these examples illustrate is that the evidence that we have for our understanding of the world must be actually very weak, since the evidence is entirely compatible with such radically different views of the way the world is. So that's a really important point, I think. This is something that we'll explore in some detail using some philosophy of science concepts in a few moments. But the point here is that if the evidence you have makes it so that there are many incompatible causes of the way the evidence appears, then the evidence doesn't help you to choose which of those possible causes is true or more likely or anything like that. So then you mustn't have very good evidence, right? Your evidence is not good enough to distinguish radically different hypotheses of the cause of that evidence. And I think that these examples show us that we're in that situation. Now you could, I think, go through each of those things that we talked about, the demon deceiver, the Berkeleyan idealism, the simulation hypothesis, and so on, and maybe you could undercut each of them, right, and show that they're false. But then I think you're still left with Hume's point that there are still many different alternative explanations that would explain the phenomena that we observe maybe equally well. And in almost all of those possibilities, the way that we usually think about the divine ends up being false. The third thing that I think is really important about these examples is that they help us to see that the things that we thought were simple, right, like that the external world matches up with our perceptions, are actually not that simple. If we stop to think about it and we're careful and we use evidence well, what we find is that even the simplest seeming questions are not that easy, and we end up being unable to make very strong claims about very much at all. Okay, and then the fourth point here is that our lack of knowledge of the natural world should make us very reluctant to make strong assertions about the nature of the supernatural. What I have in mind here is that we think we know the natural world, but if one of these simulation hypotheses is true, then we really don't. In other words, our claims about the natural world might end up being false, or they're very weak, or the evidence doesn't support them, or however you want to put it. But I think it's obvious that we know the natural world much better than we know the supernatural, right? We have to make inferences about the supernatural from the way the natural world is. So we have to know the natural world first before we can make those inferences about the supernatural. So we know the point here is that the supernatural is less well known than the natural world. And these arguments that we just showed a few slides ago show us that our knowledge of the natural world might not be very good at all, and therefore our knowledge of the supernatural is going to be even less good. Now, there's another point here which I think is an interesting point. David Hume emphasizes this in some of his other works. Let me put it this way. The universe might be a simulation, right? We can't prove that it's not, but we usually don't believe that it is. It's very difficult to believe any of those skeptical hypotheses like the demon or the simulation, right? It might be true that we're in the matrix, it might be true that we can't distinguish being in the matrix from being in a real world, but nevertheless we don't believe that. And the way that Hume puts this is that we have a natural belief or a natural tendency to think that the world matches up with our perceptions in significant ways, and that's not something that we can overcome using philosophy, he says. We're just sort of hardwired as the kinds of beings that we are, that we make that kind of inference, that we use that kind of foundation for running our whole lives. And since we can't get out of it, well, we just have to accept it, that that's how it is. We don't believe that the world is a simulation, even though we can't prove that it's not. So that's also, I think, an interesting epistemic point. All of this together, of course, should make us epistemically humble. We should be reluctant to make very strong claims about what we actually know. The best position then is to say simply that we don't know the nature of the universe, or we don't know the nature of the cause of the universe. And if that's the case, then since we know the supernatural less well than we know the natural, we have to say the same thing about our knowledge of the supernatural, that we don't know very much or anything about the nature of the divine. Okay, so that's the ultimate point here of this whole lecture about simulation. All right, so I've mentioned a few of these ideas before. These are all worth looking up if you want to get more detail about them. The common perceptual illusions are things like the Muller-Lyer arrow illusion, where you've got two lines that look like they're different lengths, but they're not. They're the same length. Things like seeing a tower in the distance and thinking that it's round when it's actually square. Thinking that you see your friend walking towards you, but it turns out not to be them. Very common perceptual illusions that we all experience regularly. Cast some doubt on whether perception is a reliable tool for getting knowledge. Now, the way that most experimental and observational sciences would address that is to say that, well, look, under controlled conditions, or using multiple different methods, or checking our perceptions, we can figure out when we're making perceptual errors, at least most of the time. And then there are going to be lots of cases under what we might call standard conditions where we can trust our perceptions. But even if you have that argument to say that perception is usually reliable, then you have the other arguments that we mentioned, like the dream or the demon deceiver. And those would say that, well, even under the best circumstances, you can't be sure that your perceptions match up with the way the world is. All right, so that's Berkeley's argument as well. I said a minute ago that Berkeley argued that all we know of an object is that it's a collection of perceptual qualities, and we have no experience of anything that we might call substance itself, and therefore we have no knowledge of substance itself. So here's the key point for Berkeley. Any perceptual quality, like color or weight or smell or taste, any perceptual quality is a mind-dependent quality. Those things only exist in minds, right? Colors, even on our modern scientific understanding, don't really exist in objects. They're the result of a causal process between a wavelength of light and our perceptual systems. Right, what's really real is the wavelength of light that strikes our retina. But then our perceptual physiology turns that photon into a color perception or a shape perception or what have you. And those perceptions then are mind dependent. Okay, in other words, they don't exist outside of your mind. So if Berkeley's right that objects are just collections of mind-dependent qualities, then you can't say that an object exists outside of the mind, independent of the mind, because objects are collections of mind-dependent qualities. So you can't have a mind-dependent thing that's mind-independent. That would be a contradiction. So that's Berkeley's argument. There's lots more to say about that. If you're interested in this kind of thing, take my early modern philosophy class where we'll talk about it in depth. For now, though, it's just an example for showing that maybe our knowledge of the world is not what we thought it was. All right, so just a couple of notes about Buddhism, useful for our course since it's a philosophy of religion course anyway. In Buddhism, the point is to escape the condition of suffering, and that requires developing an awareness of how reality really is. Because if you don't know how things really are, then you're going to be attached to wrong ideas, and then you're going to suffer, right? Because you're going to be wrong about lots of things. So what Buddhists concluded was that since the forms of things are transient, in other words, they're always changing, they come to be and they pass away, then those things are not really real. They're illusions, they're temporary, they have no real identity. And if that's the case, then any knowledge we have of appearances in the world now is not really knowledge. It's just an appearance and an opinion, and it's wrong because the thing that we have the opinion about is not really real. Now, there's also a process in Buddhism where we project what we think is true onto the world, right? So we think of an apple as an external object, but that's us, right? We're projecting that onto the world. And so ultimately what the Buddhists say is that what we call reality is, as a whole, is a projection of our minds. It's a thing that we attribute to the world. It's a framework that we impose on the perceptions that we have, but that's an illusion. It's not true. So our perceptions of the world are illusory. Our attributions about what causes those perceptions are illusory or false, and therefore our perceptions and our attributions don't reflect the way the world really is. And so that would apply to everything, our knowledge of nature and our knowledge of the divine. And so you can see here that Buddhism is trying to get us to not hold opinions about the world very strongly, because if we do, then we can have false beliefs. False beliefs lead to suffering. And so if we can release ourselves from those false beliefs by recognizing that the world is an illusion, then we're not going to assert that the world is the way that it appears. Same thing goes for the doctrine of no self, which I've already explained. All right, so the conclusion here is that impermanence, mental projection, and no self together show us that reality, whatever it is absolutely not like what we think it is or what we perceive it to be. So there's no truth in those perceptions or in that impression of reality, and so we should release ourselves from attachment to that, and thereby release ourselves from certain kinds of suffering. All right, so all of that takes us to Nick Bostrom and the simulation hypothesis. I think I said his article was published earlier than this, but 2003 is one version of it. Nick Bostrom starts from a fairly straightforward claim, namely that it seems likely that our technology will advance to the point that we will be able to create simulations of universes. He says it's just a question of computing power. Now, he's not thinking here of the kinds of cosmological simulations that we're currently doing, because that's a simulation of just stars or galaxies or black holes or various other fairly massive astronomical objects. Those kinds of simulations are still fairly incomplete, and they're only good for certain kinds of purposes. What Bostrom is thinking of is creating a simulation that exactly recreates the universe. Not just the large-scale things like planets and stars, but the small-scale stuff like atoms and animals and whatever else. So this would include, Bostrom thinks, the mental experiences of beings like us. So he's kind of imagining that, some very advanced simulation video game just keeps getting more and more advanced, and more of the universe gets included in it, including more and more of the people, more and more of the animals, more and more of the atoms, and so on. And he thinks that if we just advance our technology to the point that we have a whole lot of computing power, we would be able to simulate an entire universe, including the mental aspects of that universe. Now, as I'll say, that's a somewhat dubious claim for some reasons, but we'll get into that later. Let's take it as a premise for now, though, that it seems likely that technology will advance to the point that we can create simulations of complete universes. So if it seems like we could do it, then it seems possible that a universe can be simulated. Okay, that's one of the points that he wants to make for the rest of his argument to work. Now that simulation could even include the action of a supernatural being, right? So that simulation is that complex. Now, ultimately what he wants to show from this possibility is that it's extremely likely that this universe is a simulation. That is, a simulation produced by some more advanced some more advanced civilization that exists outside of our universe. Now that's a strange conclusion to draw from the possibility of there being a cosmological simulation, but let's see how he gets there. Note that if Bostrom's simulation hypothesis is true, that means that the gods that we think of in our universe, or maybe even that exist in our universe, are false. They don't really exist, they're just part of the simulation. So in that case, all of our theological knowledge is simply mistaken. All right, so here's the argument in a little more detail. Premise 1. In the future, it seems likely that humans will develop sufficient computing power to simulate the past, and that includes our ancestors or our forebears, right? And it could be that we run a great many such simulations, and if they're all sufficiently powerful, that would also simulate a huge number of human minds, right? Maybe the ones in the past, maybe even the ones that are present now. So the point is that we could run more than one simulation of this universe and its past, have multiple copies of it, say, and those simulations, if they're really sophisticated, would include simulated minds. And those simulated minds would have the very same kinds of experiences that we have as we're going through our lives. So he's imagining here that the simulations are so powerful that those minds are actually self-aware, that they're conscious. And from there, then, he concludes that, well, if we could run multiple simulations like this, presumably there are other advanced civilizations elsewhere in the universe that are also running these simulations. And so now there's way more simulated minds than there are real minds. And you can make up some number here, right? But maybe it's billions of times more simulated minds than you have actual minds. And then he concludes, well, then it's most likely that we too are simulated minds. In other words, we're living in a simulation. We didn't create it, some other set of beings created it, and they're simulating us, including our mental experiences. Now, I really dislike this argument. I think that it's not a good argument, but it's actually kind of tricky to figure out what's wrong with it. One point to make is that it depends on a kind of a controversial theory of mind, which says that minds are just computers. That's a view in philosophy of mind called physicalism. It's sort of a standard view for folks who believe that artificial intelligence is possible, but there's actually no proof that it's true. Now, there's no proof of the opposite either, right? That computers are not able to be minds, no matter how sophisticated they get. So the point is that we're kind of unsure what it would take to simulate a mind. Would it take a computer that's extremely advanced, or would it take something besides that? So part of the point that I'm making with this critique is that we really just don't know whether the mind is just a computer. And in that case, we can't know that making a complete universe simulation is even possible, that a simulated mind could be conscious. There's also what seems to me, at least, a strange-seeming statistical argument in Bostrom's overall simulation argument. And part of what I'm getting at here is that he's making an inference from the fact that most minds are simulated to the claim that we are simulated. That's population to sample reasoning, if you're familiar with that in statistics, but maybe it's not reliable, right? Maybe that isn't a good inference. Maybe we don't have good reason to think that our minds are like or unlike simulated minds. And if we lack that inference, then, or that information rather, then we can't make that inference. The third point is kind of related to the first point as well. Like, maybe it's true that minds are just computers, right? But saying that you could simulate a universe with a very advanced computer simulation and that it's merely a problem of computing power might be understating the depth of the problems here. I mentioned cosmological simulations a few minutes ago, and those are far more simple than the simulations that Bostrom would have us imagine. But in those cases, we're still simulating huge structures like galaxies as pixels, right, as units, ignoring the internal dynamics and detail within them. So it could be that our cosmological simulations are roughly correct at a certain level of abstractness or a certain level of approximation, but that they're not actually good simulations. So if we can't even simulate a galaxy, say, or a cosmos, just in terms of its physical matter, how are we going to simulate something that's way more complex than that, like an ecosystem or a conscious mind? So to say that it's merely a problem of computing power is, I think, really understating how difficult it would be to create a full universe simulation. All right, well, something to note here is that Bostrom actually presents his argument as what's called a trilemma. I'm sure you've heard of a dilemma, right? A dilemma is where you have two options and you have no good grounds for choosing one or the other. You've got to try to figure out which of the horns of the dilemma to accept. Well, in a trilemma, we just have three possibilities. So here are the three possibilities. He says either few civilizations ever get to the stage of producing high fidelity ancestor simulations, or the post-human civilizations that are interested in running such simulations is very close to zero, or the people with our kinds of experiences, the fraction of people with our kinds of experiences that are living in a simulation is close to 1. Now you can dive into those details if you want and think about them really carefully, pause the video or whatever, and think about what each of those claims mean. But essentially he's saying that either it's not possible or not very common for post-human civilizations to be able to simulate full universes, including minds, or they don't care and they're not doing it, or we are all more likely to be in a simulation than not. Now, I'd be much happier embracing the trilemma options 1 or 2 here than I would 3. But some other people, as I mentioned, like Elon Musk, have said that 3 seems to them like a better option than 1 or 2. So that's just raising a possibility here, right? It's not a proof, really. It's sort of like a feeling or something like a preference that some people have. But in any case, that's the simulation argument that Bostrom presents. I think that the kind of speculation that we see in the simulation argument is actually really bad. We should try to avoid it. I mentioned to you David Hume earlier, and he has an antidote, you might say, to this kind of speculation. The first part of it is to say that, look, we're just constituted to think that the external world corresponds to the way that we perceive it, and we can't really get out of that. It's sort of built into us, right? Just like if we look at an object that's blue, we see the color blue. If we look at an object, we think it's external, right? It's just the way it is for us, given the kinds of minds that we are. So in that case, part of what Hume's getting at is that speculation about other kinds of possible causes is empty. It doesn't lead to anything. It can't really mean anything, and we can't even do anything with it. We can't really believe that the external world isn't there, or that it's different than how we basically perceive it to be. And so all of these speculations about other possible causes are pointless, right? We can get out of various kinds of disputes, philosophical disputes, just by recognizing that, well, that's the kind of thing that we can't believe anyway. Let's go on and do other things that actually make a difference or that can matter. So you might be able to doubt the existence of the external world while you're doing philosophy, right? Or the way that Hume puts it, in your philosophical moods. But in ordinary life, you just can't believe that the external world isn't there, right? And if you tried to, you'd probably die. You'd get run over by a car, you'd eat something poisonous, or you'd fail to eat at all, and you would end up not surviving. So in some sense, it makes sense, right, that our minds are such that we can't help but believe the external world is real, because that belief, having it be kind of an instinct or a reflex, is good for us because it's good for our survival. And so given that limitation on the kinds of beings we are, Hume would say we should avoid extreme speculation that's beyond any possibility of getting knowledge. So if we have no way of proving some claim one way or another, if it's just impossible for us to prove something one way or the other, Hume would tell us, look, that means it's pure speculation, and you should avoid getting into controversies about it because it's an unanswerable question, essentially. And since we can't prove these kinds of claims one way or the other, we can just say that they're beyond our knowledge. And then we can try to get on with understanding the world as it does appear to us, right? So within the realm of what is possible for us to know and do, then it makes sense for us to put our effort there. But we can't really make any claims about what caused the world as we perceive it, so we shouldn't pretend that we can. Right? Just get on with it. If you ever study Immanuel Kant, you might come across these two words, phenomenal and noumenal. For Immanuel Kant, the phenomenal world is the world of perception. The noumenal world is what's beyond perception, that causes our perceptions. And Immanuel Kant thinks that we can make inferences from the phenomenal world to the nature of the noumenal world with a lot of restrictions and limitations on our knowledge. But Hume says, look, we can't do that reliably. It's not really something that we're able to do well. so let's just move on and try something else. In other words, it's pointless to dispute about or to worry over things that we cannot know, like the cause of the universe. We have to live as if the external world is real, but that's all, right? That's all there is. We can learn about that external world, how the laws of physics operate, for example, the laws of biology or whatever, but making inferences from those to some other noumenal cause is, in Hume's light anyway, always going to be a kind of a speculative error. All right, so what if we were to carry this philosophical lesson into our ordinary lives? Well, we'd have to conclude that we know less, maybe a lot less than we think we do. And we'd have to recognize that our knowledge of fundamental causes is especially bad. And we certainly know far less than we wish we knew, right? We would like to know the causes of the universe or the nature of the divine or whatever else, but it seems like that's not within the realm of possibility. And so the ultimate point here is perhaps that we should just be cautious and skeptical in our beliefs, be aware when we're making claims that cross our ability or go beyond our ability to be able to prove or to bolster with evidence. And in that case, we should also be non-dogmatic about the kinds of claims that we make about the way things are. We can say, well, things seem to be X, but saying that they are X is maybe a claim that is beyond our ability. Now that would apply, as I said, even more strongly to claims about the supernatural than it does about the natural, because our knowledge of the supernatural is always less than our knowledge of the natural. And so if these arguments bring us to the conclusion that our knowledge about the natural world is not very secure and we should be careful about our claims to know things about it, well, that applies even more strongly to our claims about the supernatural. All right, so, well, we might or might not exist in a simulation, but either way, thinking about this topic can lead us to these conclusions that promote epistemic humility. Thanks for your attention. Talk to you next time.